World's Colombian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago was very important to Beloit College on a number of fronts, apart from the fact that a lot of students and faculty went down to see the fair. Both of our museums had founding collections that came from the fair. Frank Logan was a wealthy businessman in Chicago, fascinated by Native American history and anthropology. He purchased a collection from a man named Horatio Rust, known as the Rust Collection of Native American Antiquities. And, he loved the collection, but he wanted a good home for it. A friend of his connected him with Beloit College, and he paid a visit to the college, discovered the college already had a small collection, called the College Cabinet, and that there was a lot of interest in it. And he ended up donating the Rust collection and some other materials to Beloit College, and the college founded the Logan Museum of Anthropology, naming it after Frank Granger Logan. And Logan became instrumental in the early history of the museum, not only with lots of materials for the museum, eventually helped fund expeditions to the Southwest, to Algeria, to France, elsewhere around the world. And he became a college trustee as well. He also was very good friends with George Lucius Colley, the son of the first graduate, or first student at Beloit College, Joseph Colley. George Colley graduated from Beloit in 1881 and was a geology major, or a geologist himself, very influenced by T.C. Chamberlin. But he had an interest in this area too of anthropology. I don't think he had any intention of becoming an anthropologist himself, but Logan leaned on him, and Colley became the first curator of the Logan Museum and sort of found a second passion in his life and served the museum for a long time, brought in all kinds of interesting materials, some of which he collected himself, both on expeditions, but also on a trip around the world in 1901, or 1910, excuse me. So Logan Museum, here's a very early photograph of it when it was in Pearsons Hall. Anyone familiar with Pearsons will recognize this spot with the skylight above, now known as the Moore Lounge. But more typically, and for most of its history, the Logan Museum has been housed in Memorial Hall, the limestone building completed in 1869. This is a photograph probably from the early 1940s that shows the nice image of the collections with people looking at them. And another thing, of course, besides the museum, is anthropology as a study became very important to the curriculum. And this is a strange photograph, but here we have women working with some materials in the museum in 1932. And then students also became very involved in some of the expeditions. We have a fine photograph here of 1935. The man in the center is Paul Nesbitt, who was the curator who replaced George Colley. And third from the left is Andrew Hunter Whiteford as a student. He came back later and became a longtime director of the museum and professor of anthropology at Beloit College. One of the interesting things is the early expeditions at Beloit College for the Logan, women were not allowed to participate, but they continued to object and protest, and ultimately women were allowed to join the men for these expeditions by the mid-1930s. So our second museum was really founded by Helen Brace Emerson. She was married to Joseph Emerson, his second wife. His first wife had passed away. She was an art historian. I grew up in Janesville, a cousin of Frances Willard, the Women's Christian Temperance Union founder. And she spent a lot of her career in the Evanston, Illinois area and touring in Chicago and so on, giving art history lectures. When she came to Beloit College, after marrying Joseph Emerson, she saw an opportunity to bring more art history and art education to the college, even art instruction. And she donated her own collection, small, modest collection of art materials and photographs, and even a big stamp collection, apparently, some ancient coins and that kind of thing. But flash forward again to the World's Colombian Exposition, 1893, the Greek government brought a large number of plaster casts of famous Greek artwork, classical sculptures, to Chicago, and there's an opportunity for people to see who probably would never have a chance to travel to see the originals. This was an opportunity to see facsimiles of these, and it was a wonderful collection. She was very excited about it. She discovered that the Greek government did not want to pay the shipping to take them all back to Greece and planned to sell them to the highest bidder. And she secured funds, she and Joseph Emerson secured funds from Lucius Fisher's son. Lucius Fisher had been one of the founders of the college, who had given land to the college and so on. His son, kind of in honor of the Emersons and his father, donated some money, and the college outbid the Field Museum, among others, to get the Greek casts. She was able to secure, now that Eton Chapel, or the chapel, had been built in 1891, that left South College. Also, the academy had moved to a building called Scoville Hall. Across from today's theater, there's a big apartment building called Scoville Apartments. Anyway, that left South College not exactly empty, but with a lot of space, and they were able to secure it as the first art hall. And here are Helen Brace Emerson and Joseph Emerson amidst a few of the Greek casts. And that was the first art museum on campus, also very much open to the public. One of Beloit's revered professors was Theodore Lyman Wright, Jr. He had graduated from Beloit College. His father was one of the founders of the city. He came back and taught here for many years in classics and art history. He was the one who founded the Greek plays as an annual event and did them for many, many years. He taught art history as well. Sadly, he died under mysterious circumstances in 1926. He had gone to North College or Campbell Hall to pick out some lantern slides for a class the next day, and he never returned home. And the following morning, they found him barely alive and unconscious, with all kinds of things in the building broken and strewn around. And he was taken to the hospital and passed away. A woman in charge of overseeing the building had the maintenance department clean up the building, and so when the police came to investigate to figure out whether this was murder or something else had happened, whether he'd been attacked or not, all the evidence was cleaned up. Our president, Irving Maurer, at the time, felt that Wright had probably been murdered. More recent investigations over the years called that into question, and so it remains one of Beloit's mysteries. He was such a well-loved man. Even the local immigrant community, a Greek community, created a Parthenon out of flowers at his grave, and we have some photographs of that. But more important to the college, a few years later, when they finally had money to create the new art museum, a dedicated art museum, they built what became known as the Theodore Lyman Wright Art Museum. By rights, maybe they should have named it after Helen Brace Emerson, but as a well-loved professor and his death being fairly recent, they named it after Wright, and they named an art library that was housed there after Helen Brace Emerson. And today we still have some of our older art books will have a book plate inside saying the Emerson Art Library. And this photograph shows some of the original Greek casts, spruced up for the new building in 1930. This is the courtyard, which is, later on they created a second floor for studio art, and it's not, which is open to the skylight, which you see up top there. But at this time, it was an open courtyard. Later on, they held plays there, including what became known as the Court Theater. Some very interesting African-American women attended the college in the 20s and up to about 1930. This woman, Ruby Bond, we have some fascinating material in the archives about her. She was from Mississippi, came to Beloit as a young child, was a brilliant woman who entered the college and went here for a couple of years and then had to leave to help her family. Many, many years later, she received an honorary degree, but in the interim, she was a civil rights leader. Clipping here. We have a lot of interesting interviews with her and a handwritten autobiography by Ruby Bond. Around the same time, Velma Bell was a student here. Her father worked at Fairbanks Morse, like a lot of other African-American immigrants or migrants from the South in the teens and 20s. She was also a brilliant student and graduated from Beloit College Phi Beta Kappa. She was the first African-American to achieve that at the college. And she went on to become a prominent educator. There's a school named after her in Madison, Wisconsin. Her son and daughter went here, and this is a photograph of Velma Bell Hamilton receiving an honorary degree in 1991 with her son Harry Hamilton inducting her. He was a Beloit College graduate who became a trustee of the college. We're going to move into the Great Depression, and I'm going to just read a little bit about something I think I wrote for one of my Fridays with Fred columns. Battling the Great Depression of the 1930s, Beloit College did everything in its power to keep its students during hard times. The administration chartered daily buses so that students from the Rockford area could commute. Faculty and staff sacrificed 10% of their salaries to cope with the college's deficit. President Irving Mauer reduced his own salary by 19% in 1932. "When will this panic end?" Mauer wrote in his diary that October. "Someday we'll look back and wonder how we survived." Something I like to share with students that kind of show how something that seems mundane can kind of give you a feel for the times and use as a stepping stone to further research. This is a clipping, Swap Spuds for Education. And we have another one here, which you maybe see Hams for Education. There's a letter, maybe tongue-in-cheek letter from someone asking about this. In September 1931, a Rock County farmer walked into the college's business office and posed a question. He had no ready cash to pay for his child's tuition. Would the college accept potatoes, hams, and vegetables? According to the Beloit alumnus, the college didn't mind at all. There were plenty of hungry students. The young man's bill was stamped paid. Now, despite the Depression, the college did have sort of a building boom, actually beginning in the late 20s with Haven and North Halls. Now North is now Wood dormitories. Of course, the Wright Arts Center in 1930, and another one. They needed a much better and larger hall for classes and faculty offices. So they built Morse Ingersoll Recitation Hall, named after prominent industrialist families in Beloit who donated money. And this walkway was originally a path that connected with the sort of famous path that goes down the hill to the college, to the city. And long ago, the Emerson family would drive their carriage this way. And the college decided to have an arch and an opening that would connect the residential and academic sides of campus. And this was the famous Fireside Lounge in Morse Ingersoll, or MI as we call it. And Many years later, when they needed more offices, they carved it up into separate small places. You'd go into a professor's office and there'd still be just a little bit of the wood panels in his office. But some years back in the 90s, they renovated the building and restored the Fireside Lounge to its former glory. This is an interesting story. Not a great thing for the college, but something that's a part of its history. In 1938, they created an admissions booklet, and seems like a mundane thing. There's a lot of just good, ordinary, but interesting photographs in it and so on of the college and college life, and it was meant to attract students here. Many years ago, I knew a woman named Susan Welty, whose husband had taught at Beloit College. Carl Welty was a biology professor, and she told me an anecdote, a story, that he had been very upset. The college had taken some publicity photographs, and this is the photograph of his class held in Pearsons Hall in the mid-1930s. And you can see Carl Welty on the far right, but just a little bit to the left of him, there's a man standing up. And she said that when the college published that photograph, they omitted that student who was African American. And I found both the original photograph right there, and I found the published version. And they had airbrushed him out along with a glitch in the ceiling. So she couldn't remember his name. And I had to do some research. Of course, we did not have that many African-American students, but I kind of blew the photograph up. I looked around, I found other images from the yearbooks and so on. And I determined that this was George Hilliard, class of 1936. And some years after that, I was able to, when I was doing my Fridays with Fred column, I wrote a story about him and called it Putting George Hilliard Back into the Picture, or something like that. And George Hilliard was a science student here. He had ambitions to become a doctor. He was from this area. There's a photograph of him with the football team. He won his B Club letter as a varsity player. There he is on the top right. He did become a doctor, and a very prominent one. Worked in Milwaukee for many years. Grew up here in Beloit on Athletic Avenue. There's a park named after him in Beloit called Hilliard Park that's short distance from where he grew up. This is just a nice view of showing the campus as it looked from the air. We have very few true aerial views. The earliest I know of is from the late 20s. It's too large to scan, but the college had a series of them made in the mid-1930s of different parts of campus. One of the things that people always comment when they see this is how many trees there are, and some of that is that, of course, that they're in full leaf, but also the college did have a lot of elm trees that succumbed to Dutch elm disease in the late 50s, early 60s, and took care of some of the canopy. But other things that are interesting to notice, the old observatory and the tennis courts in the forefront, those were taken down, and that's where the current Mies Theater lies. I always wondered what those little posts were near the, kind of between the observatory and the tennis courts. It took me years and years to figure out what those were. Somebody would say, oh, they're looks like tombstones. Somebody else would say, no, they were keeping bees. Finally, I discovered a photograph that solved the mystery, and they were archery targets. And they were actually, before women had intercollegiate athletics, they had all kinds of physical education activities, archery among them. And there's a great photo somewhere of women in that area with those targets in the distance. Other things that you can notice here, students made their own paths between Pearsons and Old Chapin Hall there and Middle College. Eventually the college put in a solid path. You'll also see behind Old Chapin Hall there, kind of far left top, you'll see an empty field That is where the college built the field house in the late 40s. To the right of Eaton Chapel and the trees was a small house, and that was known as the Porter House, and that is today where the Morse Library is. Another aerial view shows Strong Stadium, another Depression-era structure, built in 1935, around maybe 33 or 34, actually. You can see it was surrounded by a rural area, and I imagine somewhere in one of those fields you can still pick up glass from the greenhouse that was there, kind of center left. In 1937, the college had its first annual Beloit Relays, which became a long-time tradition, lasting with a gap or two over 40 years, and then more recently revived again. One of the things about Strong Stadium was that it had lights, so they were able to have some nighttime events, and here's one of the early relays, 1939, with a Beloit runner crossing the finish line in a relay. For some reason, the guys on the right are wearing pith helmets. I'm not sure why, but they don't want to be hit by batons or something. Another tradition from the era, and you'll find a lot of these in the Beloit College yearbooks, there were many queens. So there was a homecoming queen, carnival queen, Beloit Relays queen, and here we have the Beloit Relays queen being crowned by Carrie Cronice. President Maurer had passed away in 1942. They had an interim year or two under a vice president named Bradley Terrell. And then Carrie Cronice came on board in 1944. Athletics were super important to the students during this time period, and they had some very good teams. One of the great athletes was from Beloit. His family, again, like many other African Americans, had migrated to Beloit from the Deep South and in the teens and 20s. And so he grew up here and was a big star at the high school. When he came to Beloit College, he, kind of like Sam Ransom before him, he starred in multiple sports. Here he is as a track star, a basketball star, but his top sport of all was football. Eddie May was one of the great heroes of the football teams of that era. There's a wonderful photo of him racing in homecoming game against Lawrence, 1940. And sort of famously, in 1939, Beloit College, with Eddie May leading them, beat University of Chicago, and Chicago apparently dropped its football program as a result of that being beaten by humble Beloit. Eddie May and his brothers all fought in World War II. There's an interesting advertisement. The Fairbanks Morse Company in Beloit put out a lot of these full-page sort of Beloiters in service advertisements. And in this case, Eddie May's father is there along with his three brothers, one of whom, Ellis May, was also a Beloit College graduate. Sadly, Eddie May died in the war. I think literally a couple days after war was ended. He died in France. Other things happening at the college. Finally, the college had its very first student union, something that students had clamored for a long time. Once Wright Art Museum had been built, South College needed something new, and so the college chose South College as the first union. And this is a period, 1941, when just before the students began to drift off, the male students began to drift off to the war. The college population was somewhere around 600 or so. The Smith or student union at South was just about the right size at that point. Other things that were popular throughout this time period, especially with dominant social life through the Greek organizations, the fraternities and sororities. had a lot of dances, formal dances, informal dances, smokers, all kinds of things that they did, usually bringing in a dance band of some kind. And the archives here have countless examples of dance cards and invitations and that kind of thing. This is one of the rare Kodachrome slides. There are some that are just gorgeous color images from a time where almost everything else is black and white. So war, U.S. enters the World War II, and Beloit College men empty out the college. The college for a few years, about 3 years, became almost like a women's college. One of the ways that the college dealt with the empty dorm space and also contribute to the war effort was they brought in the 95th College Training Detachment. For many years, I would actually hear from men who had participated in that and wanted to come back for a visit or wanted a photograph or something. Now I hear from their families. They trained on campus and they lived on campus. And this is a great photograph showing them between kind of similar to the World War I photo we saw earlier with the chapel, Middle College, and then off to the right out of sight is Pearsons Hall. The women mingled with the men and did, had social gatherings with them. They did parties. They ate together on occasion and did other things to try to keep the morale high. And here we can see Pearsons in the distance, and to the right, Old Chapin Hall. And we have another kind of rare color view of men training here. This is where the field house would go up after the war. And you can see on the right, the white building is the Brown Swiss Association. And kind of off far to the left, you can see the Catholic Church, which became the Angel Museum, which is now going to be Visit Beloit, I believe. Beloit College lost quite a few students and alums in the war, and these are some veterans after the war pointing at some of the people they knew who died in the war. This is this plaque still exists. It's in Eaton Chapel. Right after the war, the men flooded back, and some of them wanted to continue their college education who had started back in the late 30s or 1940, 41, and came back. Others had, fought for years and missed the opportunity. Suddenly, the college had a student body over 1,000. And initially, some of the men, they housed some of the men in the gymnasium, in the Smith building. But they also, because there was such an influx, they had to build temporary housing. And this is housing for returning veterans. There were multiple spots on campus where they built. These were Army surplus barracks. Some of these still exist in South Beloit. They were converted into apartments. So these temporary buildings are still going strong all these years later. A note about women's athletics. Again, I mentioned earlier, Archie was popular. They had horseback riding, canoeing, but they did some softball and basketball, but all intramural. One of the popular activities was water ballet, an organization called Terrapin. I always have a feeling looking at this photograph that the woman in the front is about to go under, but we don't have the next photograph. So, but that lasted, some version of Terrapin lasted for decades. Right after the war, Carrie Cronice and Bradley Tyrrell bought an Army surplus airplane hangar from the US government, decided to build a field house. The old gymnasium was not up to code, and so they were having to use gyms in town, in the high school, and also the local YMCA. And so the idea here was a morale booster after the war, not only to bring in a strong athletic program, but also with a field house of that size, they could house commencements, and they could also bring in major entertainment. And they hired an alum named Judd Allen to bring in some of that entertainment. I think we have a picture coming up. Wonderful photograph of the field house at night. Very, very early 50s, one of our Beloit College students, Ray K. Metzger, was hired by the Beloit College News Service. And we literally have probably a couple thousand of his photos, including quite a few that he sent to us later. Ray K. Metzger became a famous art photographer. But even as a 19, 20, 21-year-old, he was creating works of art, journalistic art for the college. And we'll see some others of his coming up. Here is one of the examples of an artist that played at the college. Along with Louis Armstrong, we had other famous jazz greats like Count Basie, Duke Ellington. We had comedians Bob Hope, the Ed Sullivan Review. Many, many years later, we had famous rock bands play here. And I think we've got some pictures coming up later. But along with this, the college hired in 1945 for the basketball season a coach named Dolph Stanley. Dolph Stanley had gone over several years in Taylorville, Illinois. He coached a high school basketball team, winning 45 games and losing 0. He was clearly something of a basketball genius, and the college brought him in. He had great ambition. Here's a wonderful, slightly later period, kind of like Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon of him. And you can see there on the bottom, his Beloit Quintet won 150 games and lost only 31. What happened was Stanley would trained his players so well that in almost any condition they would win. And in fact, they won all of the conference games for several years, 10 games each year. They were 10-0. And then they beat schools that were many times the size of Beloit College. And it became a big draw to the local area. It became nationally famous. Beloit College was followed from afar, and there's hundreds and hundreds of newspaper clippings from all over. The college created nice programs. And this is one that's autographed. They had a great photographer named Bob Miller who covered some of those early Stanley years, followed by Ray Metzger. Here's a photo of by Ray Metzger. They were nicknamed the Bucket Brigade. And just a little more about it. The Fieldhouse dedication was on December 6, 1947. Some 3,500 fans jammed the bleachers. From a spot on the balcony, President Carrie Cronice presented the Fieldhouse to the student body and mentioned the place it will take in activities of the community, as well as college nature. Beloit beat Lawrence 73-38. The 1947-48 team, the first to use the new Fieldhouse, grabbed the championship by winning all 10 conference games. Their overall record was 24-3. When famed coach Dolph Stanley took on the college's basketball team in 1945, he inherited a moribund program that had not fielded a winning team since 1939-40. Within a couple of years, Stanley's teams posted win-loss records of 22-5, 24-3, 29-4, 25-3, ultimately leading to Stanley's 238 wins, 57 losses coaching record at Beloit College, and enormous crowds flocking to the new college field house. One of his players was Ron Bontemps, who was in the 1952 Olympics in Finland. Another great Ray Metzger photo. The thing about Metzger and basketball, it seemed like he was able to make basketball look like ballet. 1951, they went to the NIT tournament at Madison Square Garden, where they lost to Seton Hall 71-57. Even though they lost, though, that was kind of the last straw for the Midwest Conference. And that year, they ousted Beloit College from the Midwest Conference. They said that Beloit did not live up to the spirit of the conference because we were doing these massive tournaments and our attitude wasn't, in the spirit. So they wouldn't let us back in until Stanley had left a few years later, and we brought in a new coach, Bill Napton. Napton had a losing season. They let us back into the conference, and then Napton went on to become a fabulous coach in his own right. we could do a whole program on the Dolph Stanley years for sure. Looking at the city, college was growing, so was the city. By 1950s, the downtown was a big hub, and you can see multiple streets with businesses, and there were, at that point, there were no strip malls and no malls, period, so everyone headed downtown, including the students. This is a lovely photograph of the way the chapel looked after they named it for the second president, Edward Dwight Eaton. In the 1930s, they renovated it, hired a Ukrainian artist to create Byzantine-style artwork on the ceiling, purchased some beautiful pews. The reason it says 1930s to 1953 is December 12th, 1953, the chapel went up in flames. It was a very emotional moment because even if some students resented having to go to chapel services regularly, it was a very communal affair where the entire student body got together with the faculty and so on. This is a color slide of the day after the fire. You can see that central portion was damaged beyond repair. Interestingly, the chapel bells continued to chime throughout the battle for the building. There's another interior view. Initially, no one knew what had happened, but not too long after, a Beloit student confessed to having set the fire. He had been, I guess, genius level IQ, had been kicked out of Yale, and this was a sort of second chance for him. But he had, what I understand, is watched some World War II era movie that showed how you could set a fire with a book of matches, and he set it in a closet that, and the fire moved from the closet upwards and burned up the building. College had to decide whether to tear the building down or rebuild, and they decided to rebuild. And so some of the outer walls were reconfigured, but they were able to salvage a lot. Today, apparently, well, if you go up to the chapel today, if you see some of the limestone blocks looking a little pinkish, that is a relic from the fire. Here's a photograph of beginning of the rebuild. We have blow-by-blow photographs of this. Again, it could be a program on its own. The finished chapel opened up by 55, I believe. One of the curious things is during that time, the college used the First Congregational Church for its chapel services. And then many, many years later, when the First Congregational Church, an 1850s era building, burned down, the college returned the favor, and the congregation ended up going to Eaton Chapel for their services. And here's a color view from the 60s, probably early to mid 60s, showing the refurbished chapel. One of the things that they did was have the balcony up above go around the entire floor except for the one side there. New president right after that chapel fire was Miller Upton, replacing Cary Cronice. He was a longtime president, and we'll hear more about him in a little bit. Other very popular things going on for students at the time, maybe not always popular, but traditions. One kind of replacing the old cane rush was the grease pole fight. The grease pole fight was a very popular, it became popular in the sense of a lot of publicity for the college. Life magazine covered it. Newspapers every year would reprint photographs. I don't know if these are Bob Miller or Ray Metzger photos. Sometimes they're very similar, but they took a lot of photographs of them. What they did was they would create a big pit and place the pole in it, grease the pole, and fill the pit with mud and crankcase oil and a whole lot of other junk. And these students, one group would have to climb the flag or pole to capture a flag up top, and the other would try to haul the students down before they got to the flag. And I guess the idea is the winning class, if it happened to be the freshmen, they could forego some of the kind of hazing that they had, such as wearing beanies. And this lasted up through maybe 1954, 55, and then the tradition faded. Another one that was very popular, though, was the homecoming bonfire. Homecoming celebrations were traditional for decades. One of the things that was popular in the 50s was the pajama parade, usually with a band playing and so on. They also had guys in pajamas protecting the football at the stadium. And with the college student body over 1,000 and never going under again, they needed a bigger space than the old Smith Union, or I'm sorry, South College Union. And because of the field house, the Smith Gymnasium was expendable. And by 1957, they had renovated it to be the new student union, and which it was until 1984. And there's an interior view of the snack bar area. They had a college bookstore, the mail center, ultimately, and up above on the top floor where the gymnasium used to be, they had a ballroom where they showed films. You can see up on the balcony there some film reel. They also had concerts and dances there. And also on the top level above the ballroom, they had roundtable offices, and which was their student newspaper, and the Gold, the yearbook, had its offices in a dark room. And I was actually the last roundtable editor in the fall of 1984 to use that office above the ballroom. At that point, it was a little derelict, and we had pigeons. Every time I walked up and down the ballroom, pigeons would flap from one end to the other. So late 1950s, this always is a shock to students today. Beloit College leads other colleges in conservatism. This is 1962, but would have been true in the later 50s. There was a young Republican student organization here that had far more members than the young Democrats. Students did like to play around with that image, though, and this is a kind of funny shot, a student showing a book, Must You Conform? Of course, every student generation seems to conform to itself. And then the women parodying the idea that they're only there to find their man, looking at bride magazines and home magazines and so on. And that kind of brings me to some of the differences at the time between rules and regulations for men and women. Women were not allowed to live in their sororities. Men did live in the fraternities. Women's dormitories had hours and strict no men policies except in vestibules and that kind of thing, or waiting rooms. And they had sort of rules and regulations. You can see the co-ed's code. And we have another little booklet called Co-Etiquette. But I'll read just a little bit about this from this co-ed's code. Clothes rank high in importance in every girl's mind, but be practical. At Beloit, a raincoat and scarf are just as necessary for Sunday vespers and for teas. The second D stood for dining rooms. Dining rooms mean food, fun, and fraternity songs, but also good table manners and courtesy to waitresses. Dormitory regulations included hours for women, with the most stringent for freshmen. Quote, all frosh gals are required to be in their dorms by 9 p.m., Monday through Thursday. Permission to stay out till 10 p.m. on these nights is granted only to those attending college functions or studying in the library. These regulations hold for the first semester. Second semester, everyone may be out till 10 p.m. During that first semester, first-year women also had to have lights out at 11 p.m., Sunday through Thursday. Quote, it's a grand feeling to be in bed at this hour with your work all done and 8 hours of sleep ahead of you. College did not allow men callers to visit women in their rooms. They may be received in women's residence halls only in the main lounges. Here's the co-etiquette booklet. And in that booklet, there's a list of vital items each co-ed needs at college, including, among others, shoe bag, garment bag, clothes brush, shelf paper, shoe shine kit, drying rack, sewing kit, pressing cloth, spot remover, soap chips, dresser scarf, and silverware for snacks. I don't think today's students would bring many of those things at all. There's a wonderful photo, though, a parody of what would happen on date night, or maybe taking their dates home from the library. This is Emerson Hall, and it's the men saying goodnight because they're not allowed inside. This is one of the enjoyable activities during this era was something called Winter Carnival, and the fraternities and sororities would create snow sculptures and have contests. And this is a color slide. One of my favorites, though, is the Volkswagen snow Volkswagen pushed by the students. And of course, along with this sort of time, in this time period, there was also a very popular homecoming tradition of creating decorations as well as floats for the parade. And again, sororities and fraternities in competition with each other. On May 10th, 1962, Beloit College President Miller Upton announced that over the summer, the college would install a $130,000 electronic computer center on the ground floor of South College. Its centerpiece would be the college's first computer, a Model 1620, built by the International Business Machine Corporation, better known today as IBM. Ready commercially in 1960, IBM marketed the 1620 as a small, relatively inexpensive, versatile computer appropriate for both scientific and business needs. They apparently produced 2,000 machines before discontinuing manufacture in 1970. The Bulletin of Beloit College bragged to its alumni readers, Beloit is one of a small number of liberal arts colleges to have an IBM electronic computer. And of course, today, our smartphones will do more than that computer, that small computer. Now, 1961, this is our second aerial view, taken pretty much from the same area that we saw earlier. I like this one again. There's some changes you can make out. Just beyond Eaton Chapel, you can see a hole in the ground. That is going to be where the Morse Library is. You can see by this time the field house. We still have the tennis courts here. In this view, you can see old Scoville Hall across from the tennis courts. And you can also see that streets would go straight through. We do not have our 64 halls yet, and the street, College Street went straight through the campus, and so on. You can also see along the river a lot more buildings that are no longer with us. Somewhat of a building boom in the early 60s. We had a campus planner named Bennett, who not only was a planner but an architect. And he designed the Morse Library. This is the Morse Library with its original entrance. Now it's moved over to the center, to the left of that entrance. And it was a big deal. The Carnegie Library had been too small for about 30 years, and they'd had satellite libraries all over campus. This was a way of bringing in everything for the time being, although later when they built Meyer Hall and Chamberlin, they put the science library into Meyer. Here's one of the favorite study areas to this day, although reconfigured differently, the balcony with the outlook over where the windows are in Morse Library. Another thing happening in this very early 60s time period, the college founded the World Outlook program in 1960, and which became very important to the college's history and gradually turned into what we have today, the International Education Department. Even in the 50s, we were bringing in a lot more international students. I think this is another Ray Metzger photograph showing a student from Ethiopia. One of the additions, once they were able to open Morse Library, they converted the old Carnegie Library into the Pettibone Center for World Affairs, and one of the rooms there included a language lab, and this is a longtime professor Jack Street offering some language instruction. And students also did a lot more study abroad, and this is a little later period, but I just love the photograph showing students at Machu Picchu in the 70s. Also happening at this time period was the very earliest rumblings of the civil rights movement. This is a photograph of Jim Zwerg. He was a student from Appleton, Wisconsin. And one thing I know about him, he had a roommate here named Bob Carter, who was African American. Carter introduced Zwerg to the writings of Martin Luther King Jr., read some of his books. Zwerg had pledged a fraternity. When he found out that Carter was not allowed in the door, basically, he depledged. Zwerg became very interested in the early civil rights movement. He found out that the college had an exchange with Fisk University, which is an all-black school, and he decided to go down and be a student there for a year. He became involved in the movie theater sit-ins and met John Lewis, future congressman. Eventually, they both participated in the Freedom Rides. A white mob hauled the Freedom Riders off the bus, beat them up severely. Jim Zwerg nearly lost his life and became a national headline as well as a feature in Life magazine, among other things. And this is a typical newspaper clipping from the time. This is, remember, the time period where the college was considered the most conservative in the Midwest, but this was not a conservative or liberal issue necessarily. Students came out for Jim Zwerg, as did the faculty. They wrote letters to Kennedy and the Senate, and we have a lot of interesting documentary materials in the archives about this issue. This is a clipping of Zwerg in the center there, just a little left of Martin Luther King, and John Lewis, a couple people down from him on the left as well. There have been a lot of interesting books written about the Freedom Rides. One of them, a book for young adults by Beloit alum Ann Bossum, class of 1979. And she was able to help spearhead bringing back Jim Zwerg to the campus, along with John Lewis, for a conference in 2007. And we have there on the left Jim Zwerg next to Bob Carter, his former roommate. And then on the right, we have Jim Zwerg and John Lewis. Other things that were happening around that time period, the Teak fraternity was the first to integrate. And they did so successfully without losing their charter or anything. But it wasn't easy. There was pushback from some parents and former alumni and others who did not want to see this happen or didn't think it was time yet. And we have a lot of documents relating to that as well. They were the pioneers in this respect. You can see letters from concerned parents, excerpt from our dean, Ivan Stone, saying that the college would never discriminate in this way. And one of the students there on the right at a Teak party are coming up here. One of the first Teaks was Velma Bell Hamilton's son, Harry Hamilton, currently a trustee, and he's in this photograph. Or actually, yeah. Another Greek group to attempt integration was Delta Gamma sorority. This is a photo of them by Ray Metzger, showing an all-white group of students in their formal attire in the early 50s. In the early 60s, not quite 10 years, around 10 years later, they pledged Patricia Hamilton, the daughter of Velma Bell, sister of Harry Hamilton, who had been in Teak. She was very talented academically, well-loved student, and they pledged her, and the National, although they didn't state that they objected to it, all of a sudden they suspended the college, the local chapter, and they also revoked their charter. And there's a huge number of letters back and forth between our president, Miller Upton, and the chapter head and others, and also sorority members here. Ultimately, the college backed them, and Delta Gamma didn't back down, however, and the local chapter decided to go truly local, go back to its original name, Theta Pi Gamma. And there's a photograph which includes Patricia Hamilton in the top there, middle row to the far right. And to this day, Theta Pi Gamma has remained true to that, their ideals from that time period. So another huge thing, and this changed the college forever in a lot of ways, was a radical educational departure called the Beloit Plan. Planned for many years, introduced in 1964. And there's so much about it, I don't really know where to begin, but I have a couple of quotes I'll read and then show you a calendar here that shows how different the plan was. Today's undergraduates live in a time of constantly changing human relationships brought on by a flood of new knowledge and the explosion of age-old tensions. These challenges of today's world will be increased manyfold tomorrow. The Beloit Plan is designed to provide the kind of education students will need to meet the demands of this new time. It represents a pioneering reappraisal of undergraduate education. It is designed to add new dimensions to the traditional liberal arts experience. The plan offers each student new ways to achieve greater intellectual growth by encouraging him to be more responsible for his own learning. It is a program for the young man or woman anxious for new challenges and for fascinating new worlds to explore. Under the Beloit Plan, a student is less concerned with accumulation of course credits and more concerned with intellectual competence and growth as a self-generating student. He is encouraged to demonstrate this competence in new ways, both in and outside the classroom. Some of those new ways: broad area examinations in the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences help the student and his advisors evaluate his areas of strength and weakness. The plan treats each student as an individual. Its great flexibility allows the students to go through college at his own best pace and to make the most of his initiative. It helps him recognize and take fullest advantage of his strengths and interests. The uniqueness of the Beloit Plan is symbolized by its abolishment of the traditional freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior classes. Instead, students will be known as underclassmen, middleclassmen, and upperclassmen during their 4 college years. This is the calendar. They ran year-round. One of the very important components was what was known as the field term. Sometimes students took multiple field terms, although they were only required to do one. They could go to college for several semesters in a row and then take a vacation term or do their field term. It was very flexible. One of the challenges was keeping a student body that's cohesive. You could enter college as a first year and get to know somebody and never see them for another 2 years because of the varying schedules for people. It also wreaked havoc on sports teams, and the college did struggle with some of its athletics. It also wreaked havoc on sororities, Greek groups, sororities and fraternities. But I think also as the 60s progressed, that was changing anyway. The one thing the college had to plan for a much larger student body. They built more dormitories, known as the 64 dorms, among others. The student body increased quite a bit, but they weren't all here at the same time. So it wasn't like we suddenly had 1,700 students all at once, but we might have 1,700 students all together. Because of its innovation and experimentation, it attracted students from much wider expanse than ever before. So we had many more students coming from the coasts and from all over the world even. That is one aspect of the plan that changed Beloit forever. We never went back to being quite the regional college that we were before. Here's a photograph of some of the students on a field term in San Francisco. The field term could be anything. They could work in offices. They could work for publications. We have examples of students working for political campaigns in the '68 election. They traveled, another student I think traveled by motorcycle through India. There are all kinds of interesting things, and we have many of these, their final reports. So it's a fascinating aspect of the plan and a fascinating document of the '60s and '70s. So here's an aerial view showing the new dormitories. I guess you could say, along with the plan bringing in students from everywhere, the '60s began to change things anyway. This is a parody of something called of the Who's Who. Actually, I think the first parody is called Who Ain't, started showing up in the '50s, maybe Proto-Beatniks or something. But in this case, we have, I like this one. It's got it's very much 1964. You have some women donning Beatle wigs in the center there, and with placards saying John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Along with some of these changes in the '60s and with the plan, students became ever more active in the civil rights movement. And one of the examples is the March to Madison, which was in sympathy with the Selma March in March of 1965. Students marched from Beloit College to Madison and met at the Capitol, met the governor there and a whole lot of other people. And there's another good photograph of them on their way. They actually had, I think, 6 students go to Selma, but not that many could go. So this was their response to that. The Round Table did quite a bit of covering of it. And there's a newspaper clipping showing Governor Warren Nowell's addressing them. Another thing that students did in this time period, in the mid-'60s, they founded a tutoring center in Mississippi. And this is a march to support that. You can see President Miller Upton on the second row there to the right. I recognize a couple of the front people too. I think Charles Ellis, and then a guy named Michael Young, who was important to the college's history just a year or two later, and was one of the students that worked at the Mississippi Tutoring Center. In 1966, this is one of their publications. There's also a brochure. And it received quite a lot of newspaper coverage as well. Here's a Milwaukee Journal, Collegians Tutor Dixie Negroes as the heading. It lasted for a few years, and like a lot of student run things, eventually sometimes they move on to other projects and it closed. But while it was there, apparently opened a lot of eyes for the students who participated, but also did a lot of good. Now we have a interesting photo here. Nixon visited in 1968 when he was running for president. He spoke before a huge crowd at the Beloit College field house. Miller Upton served as chairman of the Wisconsin United Citizens for Nixon Agnew. Pat Nixon, Miller Upton, and his wife June are among the dignitaries on stage. But the students were not necessarily enamored of Richard Nixon, as you can imagine, by 1968. Many of them were pretty interested in Eugene McCarthy, among others, in the Democratic side. And one of the students, I think, decided to rib Nixon by hanging a banner, which you can see to the right of him, and here's a blow up. It says, "Nixon, save my chastity." Another thing going on as the early hippies began to infiltrate the college. Among others, they started an underground newspaper called Mega Middle Myth. And there's a quote from the Beloit Daily News: "Those who dirtied themselves in community with a so-called underground newspaper ought to be made to chew on a bar of soap while being whacked on their bare behinds with a razor strap." And It lasted for a couple of years. We have several issues, but not an entire run. I have a feeling whoever the archivist, or the archivist was Robert Ehrman at the time, probably didn't have access to some of these things, and they've kind of dribbled in over the years. And a typical wild cover of the time shows President Nixon on the toilet, and kind of making fun of the Daily News on the bottom. It says, under new management, but the same old awful. OFFAL. Among the articles and artwork, there's plenty that kind of are of its time. This is from Mega Middle Myth, and there were other underground papers. There was one called the People's Dreadnought. There's one called the Beloit Times, and we again have scattered issues of these papers. Remembering we had Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong at the Field House by the 60s, we were able to bring in some famous rock acts at a time where they weren't jet setting around, but rather traveling by bus. And, they would have dates in between Chicago, Milwaukee, and Madison and come to Beloit. So here's an example. Unfortunately, we have no actual photographs of them playing here, but the Jefferson Airplane played at Beloit College, as did Cream with Eric Clapton, among others. I know that the Byrds played the Eaton Chapel in 1966. We also had the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, Mahavishnu Orchestra, and others, and Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. And this, I think, is an actual photograph of Zappa at the Field House, and then the poster that we do not have a copy of, but I've managed to find a picture of online of Zappa's coming here. And I've heard various versions of the story, but apparently he said to the crowd that the word Beloit is the sound you make when you drop a quarter into a toilet bowl. So kind of like Beloit. To be fair, one sport that continued to do well under the Beloit plan was basketball. And Bill Napton had won many conference championships throughout his career here, which lasted into the 90s, and had many great teams. This particular team includes a couple of brothers who later played professionally. Kit Jones, tall man, center right, and a couple people down on the left from him, his brother Jim Jones. But any one of these guys was practically a star at that time. Other things happening in the later 60s. Of course, the Vietnam War became ever present in student minds, and there was a lot of informational activism, trying to educate students who wanted to know what their choices were, and others. And this is a photo that is an example. And there were also protests. This is a Beloit Daily News article, Students Protest War, with a photograph of the students carrying the flag, and I think a statement to the Beloit Daily News office. They also had a big rally over at Horace White Park. And I know we have an editorial by the Beloit Daily News actually praising how orderly the students were and how well run the rally was. Another issue, as the civil rights movement nationally began to turn into Black Power after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there were other assassinations, and '68 was a devastating year nationally, and the college yearbook of that time reflects that, with all kinds of photographs of violence and photos of people that had been killed during the war, Vietnam War, and so on. Some Black students on campus had issued a set of recommendations to the college in 1968 when they really felt that they had not received any kind of recognition for them. They issued demands and became more proactive. They had sit-ins. They kept the library open all night by sitting in the library. They sat out in front of a trustees meeting. They also took over the admissions office for a certain amount of time. They wanted to change the curriculum, bring in more Black students. bring in Black faculty, have a place for Black students to live together, and so on. There's a huge number of letters and posters and documents and so on in the archives about this. This is one of the roundtable. Roundtable covered it extensively. This is one of their issues, the front cover. And for years we had no photographs, but all of a sudden a bunch turned up in one of the college buildings' attic. And then gradually I found a couple on eBay that had been turned up, old news service photographs. And this is one of them, showing them at Middle College, the admissions office when it was there. And here's another photo. They put up their own posters and played music and so on. And then the college responded in a number of ways. One of the newspaper clippings say they win the demands at the college. You couldn't say they literally won every demand, but the college decided to make a best faith try in as many ways as they could. One of the things that they did was create an admissions brochure, which was designed to attract Black students. And then they also created the Center for Community Development and Higher Education, which was a college-run organization, but interacted with the community quite a lot. And there's under its jurisdiction was the High Potential Educational Program, something like what we call Help Yourself Today, which was designed to help train students to come to college and to help them become successful when they were at college. And they gave them a building on Church Street for their offices, and you can see them in their office down on the right. And this is the building, currently still a house that the college uses as student housing. Other things that were happening in the 60s included the building of Meyer and Chamberlin halls. Pearsons Hall was really inadequate by this time as a science center. They needed something more modern. It took a couple of years to build, and the only part of it that's left today is, since we have yet another new science center built about 10 years ago, is Meyer Hall, which you can see on the left there, formerly with a skywalk leading into Chamberlin. This is a lab in Chamberlin. We had a very strong science department at that time, and this attracted a lot of students to the college. One of the student-run organizations the college helped sponsor at the time was called Environ Van. Students would travel throughout the Midwest, basically the Mississippi River Valley, and bring environmental education to high school students. We have a lot of interesting documentary materials relating to that as well that deserve a program on its own again. It was a wonderful program, lasted a few years, but like a lot of things at the college in that time period, the student interest changed. Also, the college had to deal with some financial issues and retrenchment and some of the things that were going strong for a year or two in the later 60s, faded by the early 70s. I throw this one in because, of course, drugs were becoming an issue. That would not have been true in the 50s. By the later 60s, there was a lot of talk about drugs. And an interesting student organization based off of one of the founders had gone to, for his field term, worked at a pharmaceutical library. He and some other students founded something called STASH, Student Association for a Study of Hallucinogens. This was actually a serious organization that created publications, had offices. The students had to take a pledge, I believe, not to do drugs while they were working for the organization. And it made some headlines. The college backed it, and eventually the organization moved to to Madison, where it ran for another decade or so. And we have some national publications. They had their own library as well. It was a pretty important thing for a while. Many student generations have spent time at the C-Haus. This was created in the early 70s in a former sorority building where it still is today. Although they currently have the lower level blocked off due to handicapped accessibility. For decades, this was the bar, and looking much the same throughout the years, except that you can see across the room. For some of those decades, in its heyday, you couldn't see across the room through the haze of smoke. But a very popular spot for students across from the 64 dorms as a kind of campus hangout. In this time period, the college wanted to expand its museums and build a theater. The theater had been in Old Scoville Hall, which was on its last legs and rather decrepit by the 1960s. And so they created the idea through the campus planning and architects was something called the South End Complex. I call this alternative Beloit because they didn't build this. The ambition was there, but the money wasn't. And here's another picture showing the shared commons with these crazy beanbag chairs. The idea was to connect the two museums with the theater and have through underground passages and all kinds of common rooms and shared facilities and so on. A big complex. What they ended up ultimately doing was building the Godfrey and the Laurel Aldrich Neese Theater. This is the Neese Theater, dedicated in 1975. And then the Godfrey building, which is a brick building attached to Old Memorial Hall, was meant to be and is the classroom building for the anthropology department. Now, as the college did have some financial issues in the 70s, they had to retrench. The student body had shrunk as other colleges began to experiment too. Beloit plan became less unique and less desired overall. Also, there was a recession in the early 70s that didn't help. And the college was hurting for a time. They ended up having to call what they call economic exigency, where they were able to eliminate some tenured faculty positions, and it was a tough time. Miller Upton decided to resign and left the college in 1975, and they brought on Martha Peterson, who was the college's first woman president, actually to this day the only woman president. She had been an educator at the University of Madison and at Barnard in New York, and had a strong background in economics and righting the ship. And her goal for a 5-year president, that was her plan to be here 5 years, was to right the ship, to get us in the black again, and to figure out how to make sure the college was healthy financially and so on. This is just a classic photo from the hippie years, the shag carpet and the box of LPs. And this photograph too, I always find it interesting. It looks to me like they're watching a blank screen, although I'm sure they're not. But this was this kind of, again, blows the minds of the current students, the idea that there was a lounge in dormitories where you'd have, if you wanted to watch TV, this is what you do, because you didn't have any other way of watching TV generally. You had to fight with people about what you'd want to watch. The other big change in this time period was that the college in the early 70s allowed some of the dormitories to become coeducational. So for the first time, men and women were living together. And that was a radical change. All those regulations and all those things, stringent rules that women had to follow, and to some extent men, had fallen away. And other things like compulsory chapel services were no longer by this time. I like this photo too because it shows the very common thing for students of this era, having a typewriter, sometimes electric, sometimes not, having a strip of whiteout to correct whatever error you had on your page. And of course, the technology of the time, some people would have a record player. She's got a little radio there, and very sparse furnishings. Music was popular, of course. WBCR radio station was going strong. Lots of interest in homemade music. This man, Stephen Wade, not only played the banjo at the time, but became a well-known banjo player as a career, and has recorded albums and written about music as well. Another sort of replacing the typical homecoming floats and parades of the era, of earlier eras, was the Turtle Kazoo Band, which off and on lasted for about 20 years. And another tradition begun in the early 70s, although its precursors in the late 60s, the Folk and Blues Festival. There had been a Delta Blues Festival in 1970 and a Blues Convocation in 1968. By this time, it was a mix, usually a 2-day festival with blues artists, some of them coming up from Chicago, including famous artists like Coco Taylor, and also bluegrass bands and folk artists and that kind of thing. But basically, your acoustic music, some cases electric blues as well. And another 70s era thing, as in terms of activism, there was a strong interest in feminism, and women got together to form something known as the Sisterhood, which evolved into the Women's Center, today known as the Feminist Collective. It's gone under lots of changes over time, but they have a house behind the library, kind of close to behind the library anyway. And one of the things they did early on was something called transport, which in one form or another lasted well into the 80s, where a student would call, from a distant building, say we're working on they're in a dark room in Wright Arts Center and wanted to go back to the 64 dorms at 2 a.m. They could go give a call to transport and get somebody to help them go home without worrying about any kind of attack or anything. And about women at that time, Title IX finally brought intercollegiate sports for women. There had been a few games between other colleges here and there in the 60s and early 70s, but nothing formal. And finally, this became a thing where the college had to gradually bring some kind of parity to athletics. So hiring women coaches for basketball, softball, volleyball, and so on. And that created some of the early stars. And Trinky Heller, class of 1980, was the first woman to score 1,000 points and is in the Athletic Hall of Honor. Here's a shot of other women's athletics, including softball and soccer. Now, around this time, 1978 or so, the college decided to abandon the Beloit Plan. It meant going back to a traditional calendar. They tried to keep aspects of the plan, including the field term. Even though the field term ultimately didn't last, the field aspect or experiential learning part of the college's curriculum remained strong and continues strong to this day. And the college, of course, remains both national and international. And I think those are relics of the Beloit Plan. Here we have an aerial view from 1980, again showing a lot of the changes, although one today would show vast changes along the riverfront. You can still see near what will soon be the college's powerhouse, Union, you can still see a whole big heap of coal. That would be kind of just left center a little bit toward the top, and then at the very top you can see another coal field that's for the Fairbanks Morse factory. So all of that riverfront stuff changed through Beloit 2000 and some other sort of urban renewal groups over time, bringing a lot nicer feel to the river. This is something I can talk about personally because I was here as a student. Something happened in '83 where all of a sudden all the 64 dorms, or at least 3 of them there, Blaisdell, Bushnell, and I was in Bushnell, lost their power. And the antiquated system underground, they dug down and they discovered that they needed a part that they could only get from some far off country. It might have been Japan, I don't remember. But basically it took a week to get this part in order to get the lights back on. So they opened Commons up for 24 hours so people could study there after the library closed, get some coffee, whatever. They had students moving into temporary quarters here and there. And then they gave everyone who wanted to stay in their dorm a flashlight. And they had an emergency light on in the bathrooms, so you could actually see your way into a bathroom which had no windows. And I was one who decided to stick it out, and it was kind of a fun week in a way. So another thing that happened in that same time period that was not intentional but turned out to be a lot of fun was a big flood outside the 64 dorms when some of the drains got plugged and students frolicked. And I was in there, not in this photo, but I was there too. And it was, one of those hot, muggy days, and there was a huge thunderstorm, and suddenly you had a lake out in front of the 64 dorms. Another thing I show students that kind of amazes them, of course, today is the old hall phone. Every dorm had hall phones. One of the things that we did, of course, would be to put a poster up on our doors where people could leave messages. And so you'd come to your dorm, your door, and you'd see, phone home or so-and-so called or whatever. That's because nobody had their own phones and they didn't have phones in their rooms. And this is the way you had to cope with it. And of course, there could be a long line waiting to get onto the phone. Student union at Smith was still very popular in the 70s and 80s, a very lived-in place by then. It had a jukebox, a snack bar. People could, at that point, still smoke. It was used heavily by faculty and staff as well as students, and kind of a real community place. One of the funny items in the archives is this poster that says service will be stopped whenever a dog is in the union. We have an early film called Fragments of a Day from about 1971 or so. And you watch it and you see just how many dogs were on campus. And they were loose. A lot of students lived off campus, would bring their dogs on campus and have them running around, and they get into the union. So that sign was the result. College bookstore was in the student union down on the lower level where the old swimming pool used to be. And it was there through the early 80s. This is a photograph of the round table layout room showing the actual round table, and I'm in this photograph in the middle, the relatively short guy there looking at the layout table with a friend named Matt Keenan, a student named Clayton Heberling on the right there. This was, Clayton and I were vying to become roundtable editor at the time, and I got the job in fall of '84. In that same time period, when I was editing the newspaper, was the last semester that Union was in Smith Building. And we published a couple photographs as a sort of a little farewell to the building. The reason it was no longer the Union was the college had decided to renovate the old Science Center, Pearsons Hall. Apparently, they looked at the possibility of tearing it down, but discovered that it was likely to damage the hill, also likely to cost more money than trying to renovate it. So it was built so well. And this is a shot showing Pearsons as it was semi-derelict. There were still a few things in Pearsons, like a computer center. I think the print shop was there as well. But some of the areas were basically mothballed and had leaking problems and so on. You can see the old place where the skylight is on the left, and the same spot after renovation, right here, became the Moore Lounge. So it opened up in early '85 as the campus center, Jeffress Wood Campus Center, and a lot of the things from the Union, like the round table, the snack bar, the bookstore, the mail center, all moved into Pearsons, as did the radio station, which had been over at Haven Hall for a while. In fact, WBCR moved into the same spot that WEBW had been back in the 1920s. And this is my friend Matt Keenan again in the center there, with a guy named Rob Driscoll on the left, and the great WBCR record stacks, which still exist to this day. It was always a great, I had a radio show, and it was great fun to go back and explore. There was a listening room. You could take any of those albums and go check them out. And I spent hours talking about music with friends up at that station. Whoops, I meant to say also that's the office. The office has undergone many changes over the years, and it's fun to look at photographs of it through the years, because they're kind of time capsules of that particular era, any particular era. Another renovation and building that happened in the late '80s, or in the mid to late '80s, they added onto the field house, creating a sports center. They redid the pool that had been the natatorium that was added on in the 1950s. And there was a greater emphasis, I guess, on recreation and athletics. And this was bringing something modern, a modern update to something that was perennially popular for students. Another thing from the 1980s that was a big breakthrough was an exchange with Fudan University in China. We'd had many Chinese students in the teens and 20s, only a very few since then. And of course, during the Maoist era, no Chinese students at all. So in the 1980s with Fudan, we brought Chinese students here, and our students went from Beloit College to Fudan. And for the first time, we had students here from Beloit studying in China. This is one of the students from Fudan. Another change, of course, in the 80s into the 90s was technology. And this is the library computer catalog after the library renovated in 1991, and a computer lab around 1990. We have some from the 80s too that show those kinds of computers, and of course students gradually moving from their typewriters to becoming computer literate and going to these labs, and eventually within another decade having their own personal computers. Big renovation in 1991 was the Morse Library, bringing carpeted floors for the first time, a big central reference desk, and special carrels in different areas in the library, different rooms and so on, that updated for the new generation of students here. Women's athletics were beginning to become more successful and big champions in 1994-95 there. Women's Center changed its name slightly, as you can see with the spelling there. And we have a lot of flyers, and they put out publications, and they were very activist. Another very active organization among the students in the late 80s, early 90s were determined to change the curriculum to reflect voices of people of different color, different backgrounds, different, just to integrate the curriculum to reflect the world as they knew it, and not as a more monochrome kind of way. And they actually pushed the college forward. And this is a roundtable article about it. The college, we have, academic senate minutes from the time period that go through this in detail. The college changed quite a bit. Of course, they added a women's studies program in the 80s, and more women faculty. And then the curriculum added these other voices, and it really changed during this time period. Black students had another set of demands in this era, and they formed a group called Black Students United. We have a few images. Many of the students felt that there had not been enough significant change since that late 60s era when the first demands came about. In this 1994, they issued another set. And we've had a lot, I mean, I think it's become a Beloit tradition for students to be involved in activism right here, trying to change the college itself. You can see here, Black Students United is fed up, frustrated, annoyed by, and tired of the systems at Beloit College. Tired of the rhetoric administration constantly uses as a crutch, excuses faculty, staff, and students try and pacify us with, and so on. As the college kind of moves forward a bit with after these protests, students come back again and want them to move forward even more. And 21 years later, Black Lives Matter. They're dealing with some of the same issues, but also new issues as our culture changes, as our society changes. So Chamberlin came down, new Center for Sciences rises. There's much more recent history that we could go into, but I'm going to leave you with a couple of, I guess I could say, timeless images. For many, many years, the college has had commencement outside. One of my favorite photos of the outside commencement was when a dog led the procession. This would be in the early 1980s. And here they have the faculty following the golden retriever through the student lines. And then finally, a photograph that every student generation can identify with, crossing the stage, getting your diploma. In this case, about 1980. With Martha Peterson as our president, and she's sharing in what's surely a joyous occasion for almost every student that crosses that line, crosses across the stage. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions about Beloit College history, please contact me at Beloit College Archives, and I'd be happy to help you, share photographs, whatever. You can also visit us, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many more stories and images that we can share, and I hope to visit you again.